Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
For all these reasons, in medias res becomes an important narrative technique, and as I said earlier, beginning with Homer, you find even the recent practitioners employing this literary technique for various purposes. Well, if I begin like this, I am sure you would wonder if you have really missed anything that I might have said before, or if it's some kind of an editing glitch that instead of beginning, because you are used to the greeting right in the very beginning, we say hi, how are you, nice to see you, welcome back again to our classes and all that. Now all of a sudden what has happened here, we began something in the middle. Is it an editing glitch, or did the teacher forget to introduce you to the topic, or did you miss anything? All these questions automatically pop in your head, right? Well, this was done for a specific reason, and the reason would be evident in the subsequent slides. Well, now forget all that you heard, come back to the beginning. Hi there, welcome to see you, all of you, in this 8th week, and we are in lecture 36. If you can recall, we have been discussing fiction, and therefore I can welcome you again to this ongoing discussion on fiction. In the last class, we were discussing types of fiction. If you can quickly recall, we discussed how fiction, if it can be compared to a tree, the types of fiction can be called its branches, and we identified the three branches, three major branches of fiction as literary fiction, genre fiction, and mainstream fiction. And within all of them, we went on discussing subgenres of fiction. Especially in genre fiction, we discussed science fiction, fantasy novel, romance, historical fiction. All varieties of fiction we have already discussed, right. So, in this class we continue our discussion on fiction from a different perspective. So, having discussed fiction and types of fiction, in this class we are going to discuss techniques employed in fiction. In other words, what we are going to share with you today is secrets of the trade. When writers write their novel or short story or craft a play, what kind of techniques do they employ when they craft a novel or when they write fiction? All right. So, these are called tools of the trade. What are the tools that are required if you want to succeed in this trade, or if you want to identify the techniques used here? So, you can also call it some kind of secrets of the trade called fiction. Okay. Let us quickly look at some of the important techniques that novelists use. Obviously, well, it goes without saying that the list here is not exhaustive, it is just illustrative, it is just to pique your interest in this concept called narrative technique. Okay. So, generally speaking, narrative techniques are those kind of devices that writers use in order to better their structure. In order to enhance the effectiveness of whatever they write, they make use of these narrative structures. It has narrative techniques employed by writers, they have very many advantages to that, but one of the important advantages why writers use many of them, of course, it is to build the storyline or to give it a kind of a turn that they want to give it, and also to make their fiction a little more sophisticated, innovative, experimental and entertaining. That is the reason why a writer makes use of narrative techniques. All right. So, what are these narrative techniques that we plan to discuss today? Okay. Before introducing you to the first narrative technique that we have in the class, I want you to pause for a while and read the given passage here. This passage is from Mark Twain's A Dog's Tale. Please read it. It is an excerpt from there. Read this and see if you can spot any narrative technique used here. My father was a Saint Bernard, my mother was a collie, but I am a Presbyterian. This is what my mother told me. I do not know these nice distinctions myself. To me, they are only fine large words meaning nothing. My mother had a fondness for such. She liked to say them and see other dogs look surprised and envious, as wondering how she got so much education. When I was well grown, at last, I was sold and taken away, and I never saw her again. She was broken hearted, and so was I, and we cried, but she comforted me as well as she could. What kind of a narrative is used here? Obviously, you understand that this entire thing has been written from the perspective of a puppy. Probably it's grown now, it's no longer that small puppy that it used to be when all this began. So, it's recounting. So, the character here is not a human being, but a dog. So, what is the technique that a writer uses here? This is called anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism. What does it mean? Well, here animals, non-human beings, whether it's an animal, whether it's a thing, whether it's a machine, whether it's a god, whatever it is, they are ascribed the qualities of human beings, and they are made to behave like human beings, they are made to respond like human beings, they are made to speak like human beings. Well, you can find shades of personification here, right? You are not wrong if you think it has some kind of shades or connections with personification. You can't altogether be wrong. But remember, the subtle distinction between personification and anthropomorphism is this, that in personification it is more symbolic, it is more symbolic. They do not actually behave like that, You attribute the quality, but they do not behave like that. It is to achieve some kind of an imagery. But here these animals, these machines, these characters, they are attributed the qualities of human being. As a result of this, you can look at the picture, here is a bird that is reading a book. Reading a book is the quality of human beings, right? Whereas here, even when you watch Tom and Jerry, it is again a perfect example of anthropomorphism. They start mimicking human beings in a perfect way. So, this technique is called anthropomorphism. So, it is a type of personification, but an extended version of personification. While personification is limited to its imagery and figurative language, here it is literal. They talk like human beings, they speak like human beings, behave like human beings. Alright, our Panchatantra tales are filled with these kind of literary devices, techniques used by the writer. So, generally speaking, fables and fairy tales are very well known for making use of anthropomorphic characters. Alright, so it is again a literary technique. When it suits you, probably you too can use it. Okay. So, now that you have learnt one major literary technique that novelists use or fiction writers use, see, here is another one. Of course, Virginia Woolf is, she needs no introduction to you, because you are already introduced to her in several of our classes, right? And this is her well known work. It is an excerpt from there. It is a short passage taken from her novel called Mrs. Dalloway. Okay. For having lived in Westminster, how many years now? Over 20? One feels even in the midst of the traffic or waking at night, Clarissa was positive, a particular hush, a solemnity, an indescribable pause, a suspense. Oh, but that might be her heart, right, affected, they said, by influenza. Before Big Ben strikes, oh there, out it boomed, first a warning, musical, then the hour, irrevocable. Well, if you look at it, what is happening here? There is, generally it is said that in a particular paragraph, a paragraph is all about a single idea. But now look here how from words, in fact it's not even a sentence, I mean idea is shifting from phrase to phrase, phrase to phrase. This is how our mind works, right? Because our mind does not work in a very linear way. In fact, if there is a path that you can ascribe to the way the mind behaves, human mind behaves, it's absolute jigsaw. It can go in any random fashion, like if you have seen Toro, right? If you have maybe in any exhibition, if you have sat on Toro, how it moves in any random fashion, something like that. This is how our mind works. So, mimicking this random nature of the mind, a writer also puts forth various images, various thought processes that run in the mind of a character, and how there is no consistency here, right? You can note the lack of consistency and how it keeps shifting from one idea to another. This technique that Virginia Woolf uses here is called stream of consciousness. In fact, a remarkable modernist literary technique. It is not that writers before them did not use it, but this literary device or literary technique came to be popularized especially in the 1920s by James Joyce in his seminal book called Ulysses, and later most of these modernist writers pick up this strategy, and in order to delineate some kind of non-linear, incoherent action, incoherent mental action that happens in all of us, they make use of this technique, stream of consciousness. So, some of the salient features here include a free association. As you can see, the idea jumps from one to the other, and looping repetition is, in fact, after a couple of sentences you are made to come back to the original sentence, then you go away, you deviate from there, a lot of deviations and coming back. And more than that, there is a very dense sensory observations. There is a very dense sensory observations, and unrelated non-existent punctuations are also used, some kind of strange words, strange unconventional punctuation. And as I said, this technique mimics the nonlinear way our brains function, right? In fact, commenting on this, one of the critics says that in stream of consciousness you find the character's mind dripping, like after you take bath, after you take shower, when you come out, like water keeps dripping out of your hair. Ideas, thoughts keep dripping out of the character's mind. That is the reason why we use it. Of course, it has some kind of connections with the interior monologue that is especially found in plays, but it is subtly different. But for time being, we can say that it talks about the way our brain works, the way the mind jumps from topic to topic and things like that. This is stream of consciousness for us. Okay. Now, from stream of consciousness, let us go to the third technique. Okay. Now, please read this and see if you can spot any technique here. It is an excerpt from David Lloyd's novel called The British Museum in Falling Down. Of course, again you are familiar with David Lloyd, recall he is one of the pioneers of campus fiction. He is one of the major novelists to have popularized campus fiction. Has it ever occurred to you that novelists are using up experience at a dangerous rate? No, I see it hasn't. Well then, consider that before the novel emerged as the dominant literary form, narrative literature dealt only with the extraordinary or the allegorical, with kings and queens, giants and dragons, sublime virtue and diabolic evil. There was no risk of confusing that sort of thing. Now I know what you are going to say. You are going to say that the novelist still has to invent a lot, but that is just the point. So, what is the writer doing here? In fact, it looks like a stream of consciousness, but there is a variation here. Of course, the novelist is talking about whatever comes in his mind, the character, protagonist, but rather than doing it alone, he is addressing the audience here, you. Now, look at the frequent use of you. In fact, you has been scattered all over this short passage. So, this kind of a technique is called breaking the fourth wall. This kind of technique is called breaking the fourth wall, because following the convention of theatre, in fact theatre is supposed to have 3 walls, and the 4th wall is called the audience. Okay. Now, imagine how a stage is built. In the stage there is one wall, the second wall, and there is one wall at the back, right. Now, there is no 4th wall. If there is the 4th wall, it is the audience that acts as the 4th wall. So, here you break the barrier, you break that barrier, and it is called breaking the 4th wall. In the drama they do not generally address you. So, here in the novel you find the novelist or the protagonist addressing the reader directly, right. That is why it is called the 4th wall. Following the convention of a stage, we call it, and as you said, the protagonist here breaks that wall. That is the reason why it is called breaking the 4th wall. That is a literary technique. Why does a writer do that? Of course, it is an experimental form in order to involve the audience, in order to involve the readers all the more, even into the creative process. It is like turning the reader also into a character, right. When the reader holds his or her book, in their hand, they also become a part of the character when the novelist or the protagonist addresses them as you, and you do this here, you do that there. So, it is a way of involving the audience, and it is also to take them into confidence and confide in them. Rather than a confidante character, here the reader becomes a confidante character. So, these are the advantages. That is why the writer makes use of this particular technique called the 4th wall or breaking the 4th wall, right. Okay. Now, let us go to another technique, and here is a brilliant passage. Please read this. In this distress, the wind still blowing very hard, one of our men early in the morning cried out, "Land!" And we had no sooner run out of the cabin to look out in hopes of seeing whereabouts in the world we were, but the ship struck upon sand, and in a moment, her motion being so stopped, the sea broke over her in such a manner that we expected we should have all perished immediately, and we were immediately driven into our close quarters to shelter us from the very foam and spray of the sea. Of course, this is you will have noticed a very longish sentence. The entire passage is one single sentence here. And this is from one of the early English novels we have. Remember, Daniel Defoe is one of the early practitioners of novel, right. So, Robinson Crusoe also is one of the early novels. We have already discussed that in our earlier classes, right, in a previous class. So, this is from there. So, that is the reason why language is slightly not simple. In other words, it makes use of lot of longish complex sentence structures, but forget the structure of language here. Now, look at the content, look at what it is describing. So, if you can see, probably here is some people are sailing in the sea and they have been starved of land for many days, and the moment somebody spots a patch of land, or if they think they have spotted a patch of land, how all of them get excited, So, you may think it is nothing unusual here. Well, that is the point here. It is called objective realism. In fact, objective realism is where it is like realist fiction. In fact, objective realism is a technique that is used in realist fiction. That is a type of fiction that we discussed in the previous class. You can recall that. So, in this here the technique is used in order to depict life as it is. That is the reason why it focuses on ordinary people, real life events, and even the so called ordinariness of the extraordinary people. That is the reason why it uses it. Therefore, whatever a character watches it here, the character goes on explaining it in all the detail. All the circumstantial details are presented as vividly and as sensorily enriching way, as enriching as possible it is described. And generally this technique is connected with the rise of the novel, and especially with the rise of capitalism in the 18th century Europe. Of course, that is when you can trace the origins of novel to that particular time period, right. So, some of the important writers who exemplify this technique are Charles Dickens and George Eliot in England, and you have their European counterparts in Tolstoy, Flaubert and Balzac. So, they exemplify objective realism, and of course, it is also used widely in early Indian novels such as Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable or Swami and His Friends by R.K. Narayan and others. Objective realism, to explain in as detailed manner, in as objective manner as possible what you see, what a character sees. Objective realism. Okay. Yeah. From objective realism, let us go to learn one more literary technique, and here we take an excerpt from Alice Walker's Color Purple. Color Purple. Please read this passage and see if you can spot anything unusual. This becomes evident right from the word go. Man corrupt everything, say Shug. He on your box of grits, in your head and all over the radio. He try to make you think he everywhere. Soon as you think he everywhere, you think he God, but he ain't. Whenever you are trying to pray and man plop himself on the other end of it, tell him to get lost, say Shug. Conjure up the flowers, wind, water, a big rock. Now, what do you notice here? Obviously, if you didn't know our classes well, you would have immediately jumped up or raised your hand and said, this passage is filled with a lot of grammatical errors, right? Now, look, man corrupt everything, he say Shug, he on your box of grits, in your head, all these things, right? It may look like as if somebody has made a lot of grammatical errors, and if you put it in MS Word, probably the entire passage would be in one big red line, right? But that is not true. It is an exact extract, it is an excerpt from the novel Color Purple. So, this kind of a language, when you use it, the technique is called colloquialism. Colloquialism is basically a linguistic technique, in the way you construct your sentences, in the way you use language, in the way you employ words and structures. It is called colloquialism. Especially many third world countries writers make use of it. In fact, if you can recall some of the poems that you have read of Nizam Ezekiel, you can say it is a colloquialism, right? Indian English poems, or even if you read Chinua Achebe, for instance, Things Fall Apart, you may find colloquialism. Even Toni Morrison to a certain extent, but not to the extent you find Alice Walker using here. So, it is called colloquialism. What does it do here? The use of language in the novel closely mimics the use of language of the people which it represents. Supposing it is about African American community, this is how they use the language, this is how they use the language. Therefore, it is more informal and conversational, and in order to bring out an authentic flair and flavor of the character, they mimic the language used in a particular geographical setting, in as realistic fashion as possible. This is called colloquialism. How do you identify this technique? By the use of distinct dialects and linguistic varieties used there. And when you say colloquialism, it is reflected in the proverbs that the characters use, idioms, especially profanities, when they curse, when they scold each other. So, it is replete with regional words, curse words, so that is the reason why it makes use of non-mainstream grammar and non-mainstream or unconventional syntax and things like that. Okay. So, especially when used in a realist fiction, it becomes very, very powerful, because it is capable of evoking a character's setting in as authentic way as possible. You feel as if you are listening to that character in flesh and blood when a writer uses this technique in his or her novels, colloquialism. Yeah, from colloquialism, let us check one more literary device, and this particular device is employed in our one of the early works, the Panchatantra. I am sure all of you have read some stories of the Panchatantra. If not read, you will have heard it from someone or the other. Okay. So, read it. This passage or excerpt is from Panchatantra. Vishnu Sharma said to the three princes, I will now begin the first part of your lessons on how friends may be lost and friendships broken. Listen then to the story of the lion and the bull and their growing friendship that was destroyed by a wicked jackal. Now listen, this is how it happened. Then the story of the bull and the lion begins. It has been heard in the city of Mahilaropia. There lived a merchant called Vardhaman. He was an honest and intelligent man and had grown very rich through his keen understanding of business and trade. That's how it grows. Now, what is happening here? Of course, you can see that the first paragraph is not connected with the second paragraph here, but they are, of course, they are connected in a very tenuous link. He says, listen to the story that I have got to say. That itself is a story. What Vishnu Sharma tells the three princes, that itself is a story, but it acts as a frame, and within that frame, another story unfolds. The story of Sanjeevaka, the bull, and the lion, another lion. So this kind of a literary technique is called, a frame narrative. It's called a frame narrative. So popularly, it's also called a story within a story. If you can recall, our Mahabharata exemplifies this particular technique, because it said, the entire Mahabharata is recounted as a kind of a flashback during Janamejaya's Sarpasatra, the snake sacrifice. Again, you are familiar with that story as well. We had discussed it in the context of Arun Kolatkar, right. So, when Janamejaya is performing the snake sacrifice yagya, that is when, of course, the entire Mahabharata has been recounted in a flashback way. So, the story of Sarpasatra acts as a frame within which a major narrative unfolds, the major narrative of the Mahabharata unfolds. That is why it is called a story within a story. Most of the times it happens because in order to draw our attention towards what happened earlier, this is used. In fact, it is one of the most preferred literary devices used in folk tales, and especially in the Indian cases of the epics and novels, the early novels. Okay. And some of its contemporary practitioners include Joseph Conrad in Heart of Darkness, Emily Bronte in Wuthering Heights, and of course Chaucer too. He uses this frame narrative in the Canterbury Tales, a story within a story. So, these are some important literary narratives that we have picked up in this class today, and of course, even in the next class we are going to discuss literary techniques. There are some more, of course, and before we wind it up, what you can see, this is how it happens. In fact, the entire Panchatantra has been narrated. It is, if you know, Panchatantra is 5 tales or 5 treatises, 5 books, and each book or each part begins with the frame narrative, and out of that frame narrative the series of tales emerge from there. So, that is how Panchatantra has been structured in a very beautiful way. Okay. And here is an excerpt from an 18th century illustration of Panchatantra. It is an 18th century manuscript. So, just out of curiosity, historical curiosity, and for an elegant reason we have used it here. Okay. So, all right, I am sure in this class we have picked up at least 6 to 8 narrative techniques, maybe a little more than that. So, let us continue our discussion of this. I am sure you are finding this activity and this class a very interesting one. Let us pick up this discussion in the next class.